Welcome to EPG Pathshala. The module that we will be discussing is The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton. I am Niladri Chatterjee, Professor, Department of English, University of Kalyani, West Bengal. The Age of Innocence, which was originally serialized in a magazine in 1920 and was published in 1921, is perhaps regarded as one of the best novels by Edith Wharton. Much of her reputation rests on this one novel. There are several things about The Age of Innocence that merits detailed discussion, but what I would wish to do today is to take you through some of the major areas that we need to keep in mind when we are reading the novel. There is one term in particular that I would want you to pay attention to, which is the term innocence, because that is a part of the actual title. You must understand that this particular term, the Age of Innocence, may have been inspired by a painting which was made in the 18th century, that is to say in the 1700s, by a British painter called Sir Joshua Reynolds. Now, what is this painting about? The painting is actually very simple. It is about a little girl who's dressed in a frock and she's sitting there with her face in profile. The reason why this painting became hugely popular is because this painting was widely reproduced as an example of innocent childhood. And this painting was also called The Age of Innocence. So therefore, there is every reason to think that Edith Wharton herself was familiar with this painting, and this painting could very well have served as the inspiration for the title of her novel. So when we are looking at this particular painting that I would want to spend a little time on, what are the things that we are noticing? We are noticing, one, that this is a child. We have to keep in mind that we are talking about a child. We also notice that the child is a girl. So therefore, what we also have to notice is that innocence is therefore being equated with childhood, and it is also being equated with a kind of girlhood. It is being equated therefore with a kind of immature femininity. The girl is dressed in rather pretty clothes, in rather beautiful clothes. So therefore, innocence is also being associated with the upper class. Innocence is also being associated with privilege. So therefore, I would want you to keep in mind a few of these things when we start discussing the novel. A, that we are looking at the innocence which is being conflated with childhood. So therefore, we are thinking that anybody who is innocent is therefore childlike or childish. We are also looking at innocence being equated with the female, because this is a girl child. So therefore, women are being regarded as perhaps being more susceptible to the kind of innocence that Edith Wharton is talking about. And also, this little girl is dressed in very beautiful clothes. So therefore, she is clearly not poor, she is clearly not underprivileged, she clearly belongs to a well-to-do family. These are the things that I would want you to keep in mind. When we come to understanding exactly what Edith Wharton is trying to do in the novel, we have to also look at Edith Wharton's life. And that is what I would wish to talk about right now. Now, Edith Wharton was a Pulitzer Prize winning author, novelist, short story writer, and designer. She was nominated for the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1927, 1928, and 1930. What Edith Wharton did was that she combined her view of America's privileged classes with her brilliant natural wit to write humorous, incisive novels and short stories of social and psychological insight. So the things that we have to keep in mind about Edith Wharton is that she is writing about a certain class about which there is another person, another writer that we have discussed earlier, who is also doing the same thing, namely Henry James. I think you need to keep in mind that Henry James and Edith Wharton also had a very long correspondence. So they were writing letters to each other. And when they were writing letters to each other, that clearly shows that they belonged to the similar class. They both belonged to a privileged class, they were both educated, they both belonged to the upper class. So that is something that you have to keep in mind when you're looking at Edith Wharton. So she clearly is familiar with the upper class. The other thing that you have to therefore keep in mind is that Edith Wharton may belong to the upper class, but that does not necessarily mean that she supports everything that the upper class does. You know, she is talking about the upper class from the inside because she belongs to that class, but she is not celebrating upper class unqualifiedly because she is also saying that the upper class has got substantial problems. And it is these problems that she is talking about, and she identifies the greatest problem of the upper class as being hypocrisy. So hypocrisy occupies a very important role as far as Edith Wharton's fiction is concerned, because that is something that interests her, how people can be hypocritical, and many of her novels deal with this. The Age of Innocence clearly does. The other thing that I would want you to keep in mind is again a reference to the title. So when you're thinking about the significance of the title, you should not only think about the way in which Edith Wharton was inspired by Joshua Reynolds' painting, but you should also remember that when she's talking about the Age of Innocence, she could also have been meaning it in an ironic way. That is to say that when she is talking about the Age of Innocence, she perhaps does not really believe that the age was as innocent as all that. There was certainly a kind of innocence, but this kind of innocence also was a mask under which there was a lot of hypocrisy, there was a lot of cruelty, there was a lot of pain, there was a lot of oppression, but this was something that is not overtly recognized. What does Edith Wharton do? She recognizes them. She focuses on them. And that is really what is important about her work. So she's writing about the upper class, but she's also very critical of the upper class. So her novel should be read as being not only expositions of the upper class, representations of the upper class, but also criticism of the upper class, revealing what is wrong with the upper class. These are the things that we have to keep in mind. But that is not all, of course, because when she is writing The Age of Innocence, she is also, let's face it, being very nostalgic. She is nostalgic because remember that she is writing the novel in 1920. Remember that the First World War has already ended. And with the First World War, the kind of life that she had known when she was growing up in upper class New York, that life has vanished. That life will never come back. That life will always be archived in the annals of history. So she was perhaps also being nostalgic. She was perhaps missing that life. But when she is thinking about that life, writing about it in 1920, when that upper class life is over, she is also not blind to the problems that were there in that particular life. The area that she is writing about, or rather the class that she's writing about, and also the period that she's writing about, which is sort of late 19th century, this particular period was also known as the Gilded Age. Now, why is it called the Gilded Age? It is called the Gilded Age because when you talk about gilding, you're really talking about decoration. You're talking about beauty. Yes? So therefore, you are looking at certain art forms like the Baroque. Yes, which relied a lot on decoration. So heavily ornate buildings, heavily ornate dresses. So this was a period where people enjoyed beautiful things and they were very interested in buying, possessing, creating, circulating hugely decorative items. So therefore it is called the Gilded Age because it is the age where a certain kind of beauty was celebrated. And if you really want to find out what that age looked like, then you can certainly watch a rather beautiful movie that was made on this particular novel that you are going to be informed about, in which you have Daniel Day-Lewis, you've got Winona Ryder, you've got Michelle Pfeiffer, who are actually playing the three main parts. So really remember that the Gilded Age is a time of great beauty, it is the time of great decoration, but of course it is also the time of sort of very, very strict rules of conduct. And what we are going to see in the novel, therefore, is the way in which people suffer due to those very strict codes of conduct. Now let us come to the main characters in the novel. We are looking at Newland Archer, who is the protagonist. He is the central male lead character in the novel, if you like. He's a successful lawyer. He belongs to an elite and affluent family and lives with his mother and sister. Now, Newland Archer is expected to marry May Welland. May Welland is Archer's fiancée. She is raised to be a perfect wife and mother. She obeys all social customs. So when you look at May Welland, remember that she is a very obedient person. She is a very obedient person. She is a very beautiful person. She is respectful of all the codes of conduct that are expected of her. And so therefore she is what one would regard as the perfect wife. She is perfect wife material. And I think in this case, you may want to also think about a play that was written around the time in which Edith Wharton sets the novel, Oscar Wilde's play The Perfect Husband. So we are looking at the perfect wife, May Welland, and everything seems to be going fine. Newland Archer is quite excited at the prospect of marrying May Welland, and everything is working out okay until there is an appearance of May's cousin, Ellen Olenska. Now, the thing about Ellen Olenska is that she is May's cousin, and she became a countess by marrying a Polish count, the Count Olenska, who was obviously European nobility. Now, this is, I think, rather interesting, and this should also therefore ask you to compare what Edith Wharton is doing with the fiction of Henry James, because just as in Henry James, you are going to see the constant toing and froing between the East Coast sophisticated upper class America and Europe, and specifically Paris. Here in the novel also, Paris plays a very important role. So we are looking at the way in which the kind of sophisticated environment in which Edith Wharton is functioning is a very cosmopolitan environment. This is a very international environment. And when you talk about international environment, we are not really talking about internationalism of the kind that, say, for example, the transcendentalists were talking about. This internationalism is purely a sophisticated upper class urban internationalism, not the kind of internationalism that people like Emerson and Thoreau, for example, were talking about, because they were drawing from other cultures as well. They were also drawing from literature and from philosophy of other cultures, but theirs was not an upper class sophisticated urban internationalism. So this is something that I think you should keep in mind. Now, when Olenska comes to America, and then we find that she and Newland Archer, so we can move on now. We can move on, and we find that Newland Archer, he falls in love with Ellen Olenska. Now, this is where the complications really begins, because Archer is so therefore Archer is devastated to realize that gradually that it is Ellen that he loves and not May. He is condemned to a loveless marriage for the sake of honoring society and its rigid rules. So this is where we have the central tension of the novel. Remember that every time you read a work of literature, there is going to be a central point of tension. Sometimes there may be several tensions, but there has to be at least one. If I have to identify where is the central tension in the novel, well, this is where it is. It is the tension that Newland Archer experiences because he feels he's torn between duty and love. His love for Ellen Olenska on the one hand, and his duty towards society that he wishes to perform by marrying Ellen Welland. So that really is the central tension, that he has to marry May Welland, but he is attracted towards Countess Olenska. What becomes even more complicated is that Countess Olenska also falls in love with Newland Archer. So there is a reciprocation of love that also happens there. But however, Archer is extremely cautious about doing anything about it, and it, for a certain extent, Count Olenska is too. They are both adult, they are both mature, they are both expected to marry other people. Countess Olenska, what she does is, she complicates matters by announcing that she is going to divorce the Count. This adds to the problem in the story, and maybe we should talk a little bit about the Count, because we never see the Count. We only hear about the Count. So the Count remains an absent presence in the novel. We never meet him. He never appears in the novel, but there are a lot of people who talk about him. He comes across as somebody who is not a very nice person. He's very cruel, and his use for Countess Olenska is simply there as social decoration. So there is clearly no love between the Count and the Countess. That is something that you have to keep in mind. There are also suggestions that the Count may also be actually sexually attracted to other men. That is something that you also have to keep in mind. So here you have several tragedies unfolding. You have got the tragedy of Newland Archer and Countess Olenska, who are in love with each other, but they cannot consummate their love, although their love is consummated after some time. And then on the other hand, you've got the tragedy of somebody like Count Olenska, who clearly has to perform his sexuality in secret, because in public he has to play the role of a respectable married man. And of course you have the third tragedy, that of May Welland, because May Welland is about to get married to a man who does not love her. So moving on, when we come to find that this is what is going to happen, we find that the Countess's grandmother, that is to say Mrs. Manson Mingot, has chosen to reintroduce Ellen into a good and affable society. And as I told you, Ellen soon announces that she intends to divorce her husband, and while Archer supports her intention to attain freedom from a coercive relation, he fears that he is slipping down into an abyss of conflicting emotions, trapped between a loveless marriage and his overwhelming love for Ellen. So this is again a reinstatement of the tension that I was talking about earlier. Now, before we move on any further, I think one has to pay a little bit of attention to the way in which Countess Olenska is received by New York society. She is not received very well, in the sense that she is regarded as being somehow dangerous. Why is she regarded as being somebody dangerous? She is regarded as being dangerous because she is regarded as somebody who is perhaps a threat to patriarchy. Why is she a threat to patriarchy? Because she's so independent. The fact that she's traveling around the world without her husband, that she is married and yet she has this level of independence, is something that New York society is clearly not very happy about. So, to use a colloquial term, Countess Olenska is perhaps regarded as a loose cannon. She is regarded as somebody who could cause a lot of damage, and which is why people are very suspicious of Countess Olenska. But of course, no matter how suspicious people are of her, this does not stop Newland Archer from falling in love with her. Now, Archer, of course, does get married to May Welland. They go for a honeymoon to Europe and return to settle down into a married life. Over time, Archer's memory of Ellen fades away to a wistful memory, and then suddenly he's reunited with her in Newport, and sparks of love conflagrate into an overwhelming passion, and yet they decide not to consummate their love. Now, upon returning to New York, it is found that Mrs. Mingot has suffered from a stroke, and Ellen stays to look after her for a while. Abruptly then, she decides to return to Europe, and May, relieved that by this turn of events, throws a goodbye party for Ellen. Archer firmly decides to follow Ellen when May announces that she is pregnant. Now remember that May actually says that she is pregnant, but she is not. So this is a lie. Ellen says that she is pregnant so that she can therefore keep her husband back. The husband wants to go to Europe, and if the wife says that I'm pregnant, well, in that case, the husband has to stay back. Moving on, Archer is filled with a deep sorrow, and he'll never be able to fulfill his love for Ellen. But that love never really goes away. The love never really goes away. He bears the grief of loneliness for the rest of his life, and in the meantime, May has given him 3 children, and she has died. 25 years later, he visits Paris with his son and is apprehensive about meeting Ellen, because it is the son who sets up the meeting between Ellen and Archer. But he cannot. So what happens is that he prefers to cherish only the past memories of Ellen, and in the end walks away without meeting her. Now, what are we to make of this ending? What are we to make of the fact that ultimately, when it comes to that, Archer does not meet the big love of his life, Ellen? What does the novel say? Is the novel therefore saying that this is a society where people ultimately put the code of conduct before their personal happiness? Is this putting of the code of conduct before personal happiness, is this being called innocence? Is innocence therefore the dogged obedience to social codes of conduct? Is innocence therefore also the way in which you uncomplainingly and without examining accept all the social conventions that are thrown at you? Is that what Edith Wharton is meaning by innocence? But then again, if this is what she means by innocence, clearly you are going to see that that is not what is happening in the novel, because in the novel we can clearly see that there are people who are definitely breaking those codes. There are people who are disobeying these codes of conduct. So therefore, we cannot actually say that everybody is sort of obeying the code that has been set for them. Wharton's The Age of Innocence is probably one of her most successful books because it offers an inside view of New York society in the late 19th century. That was her milieu. And she asks her readers to get into the atmosphere of an upper-class aristocratic society as its inhabitants move about in their world of subtleties, innuendos, and strict adherence to the dictates of a fashionable yet conservative society. Ostensibly, duty towards the family and to society ensures that each individual will behave according to a very strict code of conduct. But of course, what we also see is that through hypocrisy, there is a constant breaking of those codes of conduct. For example, the upper-class families who so eagerly attend Julius Beaufort's balls, enjoy his lavish hospitality, are the same people who disdain his commonness and who will mercilessly exile him following his business and financial collapse. So one wonders how the title of the novel justifies itself, for there is doubtless decay lurking under the surface of this Gilded Age. So what we are really looking at, therefore, is that she uses the title very, very ironically. When she is calling it the Age of Innocence, she clearly does not mean that it is the Age of Innocence. So she's interrogating the idea of innocence. Who is innocent? What is innocence? Those are the questions that are being asked in the novel. But then again, there are some people who believe that innocence is personified in the character of May. The purity of May's character brought up to remain innocent of the corruption that surrounds her. Archer too, for all his passion and discontent, is naively innocent in believing that a love affair with Ellen could escape being branded by society as anything other than a common act of adultery. And remember that May Welland is very, very well aware, because when May Welland dies, in her deathbed, she actually tells her son, she actually tells the children that they should always trust their father, because their father has sacrificed the single most important thing in his life for the sake of the family. So we clearly know what this single important thing is. The single important thing is, of course, Countess Olenska, and this is something that May is well aware of. And this is something that she actually admires her husband for, that, you know, he could have very well run off with Countess Olenska, but he does not do that because he respects social codes. On a larger scale, old New York itself is an innocent society, one that is so immersed in the minutiae of its social codes that it could never envisage the chaos and destruction that would come towards it, and indeed that would bring it hurtling into the 20th century. So we are looking at a time when people were so obsessed with who is wearing what and who is meeting whom and who gets invited to whose parties. People are so concerned with this that they simply do not understand. They are so innocent of the fact that the world is about to be thrown into an enormous and a very, very painful world war, and that war would actually end up ending what we call the Gilded Age. Now, what we really come to, therefore, is an understanding of the way in which Edith Wharton is trying to portray for us a kind of society which she, longs for. She is nostalgic about. She clearly misses that sort of childhood of privilege, of luxury. But of course, she also acknowledges that behind all the privilege, behind all the luxury, there is a lot of cruelty, there is a lot of pain. And when you read the novel, do be aware of this central tension and see how the characters actually perform these very difficult roles in society, where they are constantly trying to somehow compromise between their personal happiness and social propriety. Thank you.